So Julia is a Georgia master beekeeper, and she's been keeping bees since 2004. She's created a very interesting citizen science website, and you can find the name of that website in the newsletter, or you can write to me and I'll give it to you. And she's gathering data on drone congregation areas, and that's going to be the focus of her talk today, and I've heard her speak before, and it's really fascinating. Julia is very keen about educating people, and she teaches beekeeping in Georgia prisons and is active in her local and state bee organization. So her title of her talk is The Game of Drones. So we're all interested to hear more about that. And without further ado, Julia, please, the forum is all yours.
Great, thank you. Thanks for joining me on this. It's beautiful here in Atlanta, so I assume it's beautiful there too. I'm going to share my screen. Ruh-roh. Can you see it?
Perfect. Thank you.
Great. All right. So I like to say that drones are the Rodney Dangerfields of the bee world. They get no respect. And that tells you how old I am, because I know who Rodney Dangerfield is. But when you're a new beekeeper, you kind of learn the basics about drones. And that is that they're the male bees, that they have only one job, and that's to mate with other queens from other colonies, and that they basically don't contribute in any discernible way to the survival of their colony. You might have even been told that drones are freeloaders and they're a drain on your resources and that you should get rid of them. However, if you dig a little deeper, I think you'll find that drones are fascinating and they really are integral to the colony. And by the end of this talk, I hope you learn to appreciate the little black sheep a little bit better. So, about this time of year in any given colony, you should have one queen, about 60,000 workers if they're doing great, and maybe 2,000 to 6,000 drones. This is definitely the time of year when you see more of the fellas. And our drones are going to be, the queen is obviously the biggest bee for you new beekeepers. Sometimes when you're looking for the queen, you find drones and you're like, is that it? But the drones are, they're actually 100 milligrams, around 100 milligrams heavier than queens, but they're a little bit shorter. They're short and stocky and heavy and strong. And this is a drone on the left with two sisters workers. And you can tell the biggest difference is their eyes are so enormous, they practically touch in the middle, unlike the workers. And they have like a blunt tipped abdomen where the workers have this pointy abdomen. Now, drones only live about 22 to 32 days. So I think they all look like this fella on the right. That's what they all look like all the time. They don't really get to be old men. So they're always young and handsome. So before I talk about drones specifically, I wanted to back up to some colony basics. In order for a colony to survive, they have to be queen right. So that's super important, right? And they have to have workers, and lots of workers, and they have to have food. So that's sort of the bare minimum for survival of a single colony. But what about the colony as the superorganism? And the superorganism is where there are individual organisms that have specialized behavior that together create one organism. And the honeybee superorganism is the colony. If you think about humans, we need food, shelter, and water as individuals to survive. But as a species, we have to reproduce to ensure survival. In a similar way, in order for the colonies, the superorganism, to reproduce, they have to have drones. And in the superorganism theory, you'll hear that the queen is the ovaries, the brain is the collective decision-making power of the workers, the comb is the liver. And in that theory, the drones are the flying testes of the superorganism. That's what Dr. Delaplane says, and I could have drawn that differently, and I didn't, and you're welcome. In order for bees to reproduce on the colony level, the worker honeybees have to raise drones. They have a biological drive to raise drones and to be drone right. You often speak of colonies being queen right. Well, it's just as important that they be drone right. But you should always keep in mind that colonies won't raise drones if they can't afford them. If there's a dearth, if they're weak, if they come out of winter weak, they're not going to raise drones because they, in order of importance, the queen's the most important, then the workers, then the drones. But if they're thriving, and especially this time of year, if they come out of winter strong, they really want to make drones. So it's really a sign of prosperity if a colony can raise drones. So if you'll let me indulge in some anthropomorphizing, I think of it as the workers having trophy husbands. Like they're out there on the flowers boasting about how many drones they can support, because it really is a sign of prosperity. So back to the general thinking of how drones are a drain on the colony for the average beekeeper. There was a study done in Scotland in the 1980s that compared colonies that were given drone comb at the beginning of the season and those that weren't. And at the end of the season, the drone right colonies were larger and they made slightly more honey than the colonies that weren't, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. And I will also say that there was also a study done in Tom Seeley's lab in 2013 where it kind of showed the opposite. But, that also proves that Pooh was right. You never know about the bees. But it's not clear cut that having drones brings in less honey. And a lot of old time beekeepers will say that the colonies that sail along and are really strong are the ones where you let them have their drones. So I want to talk about drones specifically, and we're going to begin in the beginning with drones. Life begins in a proper cell. They are bigger bees and they need a bigger crib. So every time a queen lays an egg, she first puts her head into the cell and she feels around with her front legs to see how big the cell is. And then she pulls her head out, turns around, inserts her abdomen and lays an egg. If she felt that the cell was small, between 4.5 to 5 millimeters, she will lay an egg that becomes a female, which means that she releases an egg, comes out of her oviduct, and as it travels over this little valve fold, there's some sperm released from the spermatheca. She opens it up, so this is released, and then the fertilized egg goes out the sting chamber and is deposited into the cell. Now, if she reached in there and felt that the cell was larger, it was about 6 millimeters or so, or larger, the spermatheca doesn't release any sperm. The egg isn't fertilized, and it becomes a male. I think about how fascinating that is, that just by feeling in a cell, her body, with her front legs, her body knows what to do. I just think that's mind-boggling. And by the way, we know that that's the mechanism. They tested out all kinds of things, but they cut the front legs off queens and found that when they did that, they just laid willy-nilly, fertilized, unfertilized. It just didn't matter. There was no pattern to it. So that's how they know. Poor queens. So drones come from an unfertilized egg. They don't have fathers. They only have one set of chromosomes. And this is true of all Hymenoptera, bees and wasps. They're called haploids. Haploids have one set of chromosomes. Workers and queens are diploid. They have 2 sets of chromosomes. And honeybees, they don't have a sex determinant chromosome like humans do, but they have a complementary sex determiner gene at a sex determination locus. So the gene on this locus, on this gene, there are alleles, and diploid individuals have 2 sex alleles, one from each parent. When the alleles are different, the individual becomes a female. So it's heterozygous, female. When there's only one allele, and when they're hemizygous, they become male. But when the alleles are the same, the individual becomes a male also. They're homozygous, and we call those diploid drones. So this is generally inbreeding. They have found 87 different sex alleles, but they think there are probably 145. So chances are, if that is happening, she is mated with her brothers, or else she's just really unlucky. But when you have diploid drones, inbreeding is bad. And humans on Game of Thrones and in honeybees. And so what you see when this happens is this shotgun brood pattern that you might have learned about. All the new beekeepers learn this, and every time there's a hole, they're like, is that a shotgun brood pattern? But this is what shotgun brood pattern looks like. And the reason why you end up with that brood pattern is when the queen lays a diploid drone, the cuticular compounds on the larvae gives off a specific odor. And that signals to the nurse bees that something's wrong. And so the workers eat the diploid drone larva. Nothing is wasted. It's protein. And they, because if they're, so they're always eaten in the colony. You'll never see diploid drones emerge. But when they have been raised in labs, what happens is they're much smaller than regular normal sized drones, and they're infertile. So it's really a waste of resources, which is why they call them. But when you see this, you pretty much know that you have a poor queen and your colony's doomed. You need to requeen. The drones you'll see in your hives are haploids because they only have one set of chromosomes. And occasionally, because of this, you'll see recessive genes expressed, which is kind of cool. In honeybees, the dominant eye color gene is black. So sometimes you'll see a white-eyed drone, which I just took this picture like 2 weeks ago. I saw one that was really cool. Or you'll see this tan beige and cherry red-eyed drones. The white-eyed drones, unfortunately, are blind, so they're not going to make it, but it is just kind of interesting to see recessive genes expressed. Okay, so we have haploid drone eggs and larger cells. And when you're first learning about bees, you're taught that all larvae are fed royal jelly for the first few days, right? Well, it's a tad more complicated than that. Workers actually feed the 3 different larvae 3 different jellies, and they're fed in different amounts. There's royal jelly for the queens, worker jelly, and drone jelly. But the biggest difference is the amount of food that the drones get. So their jelly's a little bit differently formulated, but the biggest difference is the amount. They're bigger bees, and they need lots of food, not unlike teenage human boys. They, like workers, their diet is switched from jellies in the last couple days of their larval period, and they're fed more pollen and honey. So drones they're fed more, they're bigger than workers, and they need some extra time to grow into adults. So y'all are probably familiar with this chart that the time to emergence. Everybody's an egg for 3 days. You see drones are larvae for longer, and then they're pupae for longer. And so they take about 24 days versus 21 and 16. But what's interesting is these numbers are not set in stone. They actually can vary kind of wildly based on temperature and food. So if it's too cold or they don't get enough to eat, it could take 28 days for a drone to emerge, 24 for workers, or 17 for queens. Queens, interestingly, stick around right around the same time frame, but it is good to know that they can come out at day 14. So studies show that larval and pupal survival rates are higher for workers than drones, and it probably has to do with the location of the drone cells in the nest. So we talked about how drones are raised in larger cells, and how does this work? If bees make their own comb, they are amazing little architects. And what they'll do is they'll make smaller cells in the center, and that's where they'll raise their workers. And then cells get larger and larger, and they'll raise their drones on the periphery of the workers, and then they'll store, of course, pollen and honey up in the corners. So the net effect of this construction served the colonies well. So back to the survival priorities, remember that a colony has to be queen right, then they have to have workers, and then they have to have drones, sort of third in place. So who's more valuable? The workers. They're more important. So if it's chilly, the drones will actually take a hit on the temperature. So in an interesting way, even in their infancy, the drones are serving the workers by providing insulation to them. And then who do you think is going to get more food? Remember when we used to go to restaurants? If you sat in the middle of the restaurant, you're probably more likely to get your water refilled than if you're out on the corner. So it's interesting that even in this stage of life, the priorities are set for the workers and the drones. Now, and however your beekeepers use foundation and they don't have the opportunity to raise drones on the worker size foundation, they'll build drone cells anywhere they can, which is usually the space in between the boxes. And you'll see that when you rip that open, some new beekeepers, especially, you want to keep things nice and tidy. If you rip it open, just put it back and they'll eat the drone larvae, so it's not wasted. But it is important to give them big cells. We do know that larger drones fly better, farther, and they have more sperm than smaller drones. So you really want to give them the opportunity to have big cells, and I'll tell you how to do that in a minute. This is a frame, a foundationless frame, and you can see they made worker brood in the middle, and then this is drone brood surrounding it. And drone brood, if you let them make it, it looks kind of like bubble wrap. Okay, so drone rearing usually happens during a nectar flow, but at all times the colony is constantly evaluating where to put their resources. And if they're raising a lot of brood, drone and or worker, and conditions change, like if there's a cold snap or it gets rainy and windy and the food stops coming in, the workers curb the amount of brood they're raising by eating the eggs, larvae, and they'll even uncap and pull out pupae and eat them. And there's a term for this cannibalism. It's called brood trimming. So workers trim the brood by eating it. Sometimes in a small colony, there just aren't enough workers to raise all the eggs a queen lays. So the workers will trim the brood. And sometimes, if you have a new queen, I just did some splits and I was looking at them this morning. And last week I saw that this new queen she laid a bunch of eggs, but not many of them are continuing. And it's because they have to have the workers, to feed, and they have to have nurse bees, right? So it's not, so the workers are constantly evaluating the needs of the colony, and they'll trim brood, which is really fascinating to think about, even in a large colony. How does one worker know what her sisters are doing? So the amount of feedback mechanism loops that must be in there are just kind of mind-boggling to think about how they know what to do, but they know what to do. And that's one thing I keep emphasizing, is that the workers aren't going to raise drones if they can't afford them. So I encourage people to give their hives plenty of room, the opportunity to make drones. And if they can't afford them, they'll stop, and they'll even kick them out and refuse entrance. It's not just calling the brood, it's the actual drones. They'll bite their wings off and kick them out the door. So, okay, adult drones emerge fully formed with all the equipment they need, but they're still developing in the first couple weeks after emergence, and they're not quite ready to mate. So for the first 24 hours, their cuticles are hardening. For the first week, they can't feed themselves, so they're begging food from nurse bees. They mostly feed them the regurgitated contents of their stomachs. On day 8, they can feed themselves, and they pretty much just drink honey from cells themselves. That's all they do. That's what they eat. From day 1 to 12, their reproductive organs are maturing. They have everything that they need, but it takes almost 2 weeks for the sperm to move from the testes to the seminal vesicles. At that point, they're sexually mature. On day 6 through 9, they go through their first orientation and cleansing flights. And then between day 12 to 18, they can make their first attempts at mating flights. So drones have one job, and very few of the drones raised are going to get to fulfill their ultimate destiny, and that is to mate with queens from other colonies. So first, we're going to look at how queens are different from workers, and then how they're equipped for their one job. So compared to workers, drones have tiny mandibles. All they need to do is pull the wax off of a honey cell. They don't need to chew propolis or wood or carry dead bees out like workers. They have tiny little mandibles, but the mandibles do have pheromones. They have a short proboscis. It's 3 millimeters compared to the workers have 6 millimeters. And again, they're not mining nectar out of flowers, so they don't need a long tongue. They don't have pollen collecting structures on their legs. They have a slender crop. They don't need that extra honey stomach because they're not gathering nectar. And they don't have wax, hypopharyngeal, or nasonoph glands. What makes them really fun to work with is they do not have a sting gland, and they don't have a stinger, and they can't sting you. So if you want to impress people who don't know any better, if you're out in the bee yard, get a couple drones and put them up in your veil. And when they're crawling around in your face and people are like, oh my gosh, there's a bee on your face, you just go, no big deal. Bees don't bother me. They can't sting you. Okay, now we're going to look at how they're equipped to carry out their one job. The drones antennae have 10 times the olfactory plates of workers, 10 times. And we all know how great honeybee workers can smell, right? They can smell, they can differentiate nectar and water and all kinds of things. So the reason why they have these incredible olfactory plates is because they have to smell queens in the air. They mate when they're flying, and they have to have this incredible sense of smell to smell the virgin queens. They have much larger compound eyes. They look like they touch in the middle. They have many more facets than workers. The optic lobes of the brain are much larger to process that information coming in from their eyes. They have broader wings, and they have larger flight muscles to power those wings. So this is how they're equipped for their job. Now, on this slide, you know what this is? This is bees mating in the sky, and it's impossible to see with the naked eye, and that's why there's really nothing on this slide. Your computer has not gone blank. Honeybees are unique in their mating behavior in that they mate on the wing or while they're flying about 12 to 15 miles an hour. And because they mate while they're flying, it's been really difficult to study because of that, and also the fact that the drones, all his reproductive organs are internal. For a long time, people thought, well, maybe bees didn't mate at all. Maybe they just sort of magically, spontaneously reproduced. But it wasn't until researchers figured out how to attach a kite to a queen and film it so they could really track her that it became really clear how it worked, because drones and honeybees will not mate in a lab. They will not mate unless they're flying way up high in the sky. So what happens is honeybees mate in areas called drone congregation areas, or DCAs. And these are discrete areas about 30 to 200 meters in diameter, where drones from many different colonies gather together and they fly around looking for queens to mate with. And while they're flying around, the air is filling with the drone's mandibular pheromones, which helps other drones find the spots, and it also helps queens know that they're in a DCA. So drones from one colony will visit different DCAs at the same time, and any individual drone will visit several DCAs in the same day, sort of like bar hopping. So what they'll do is drones can fly for about 30 minutes. That's how much they suck up a lot of honey, and that's how long they're powered. So they'll maybe take 10 minutes to get to a DCA. They'll fly around for 20 minutes, and then it takes 10 minutes to get back. Then they'll refuel, clean themselves up, and head out to maybe another DCA, and they'll go to several in an afternoon. They typically go in the afternoons. The books will say 12 to 3 or 1 to 4, but in warmer climates, they actually fly much later in the day. And in Atlanta, they fly between 3 and 7. That's when I see most bees in the drone congregation areas. And I talked to a woman who did research at the University of Florida, and she said she was doing some work with drone congregation areas. And she said she almost gave up because she wasn't seeing any drones anywhere, between 12 and 2 or 3, whenever the books say, or the prime time. But in Florida, they fly much later too. So if it's warmer, they definitely fly later. And that's good to know when you're looking for drone congregation areas. So these DCAs are mysterious, and that is because they remain constant year after year. There's a DCA in Sheffield, England, that is said to have bees in it since 1722. How crazy is that? Now, the drones pretty much all die out in the fall because they're only being raised in order to mate. There's no mating going on in the winter, and they are a drain on resources. So the workers kick them out, or they refuse them entrance in the fall. You always know the weather has officially turned when you see a bunch of dead drones in front of your colonies. So there's no intergenerational learning. And we also have never seen drones communicating in the hive. So how do they know where to go? It's really mysterious, but there are some things that people have observed about drone congregation areas that give us some clues. They tend to be depressions in the landscape. So if you kind of hovered over your apiary and looked out and looked around, they would sort of head for low spots. And also they will happen if there's like kind of a drop off in elevation. It can be pretty small also. Visual cues. So they often, there can be like a tree line that they will follow, a windbreak. It is said that a lot of DCAs are like an open field lined with trees to provide a windbreak, or an open field with a cliff, or even a parking lot with buildings to provide a windbreak. It's much easier to mate when the wind's not too blustery. And there's also a possibility that DCAs happen where there are magnetic anomalies in the earth. All honeybees have iron particles in their abdomens, and we know that workers will use magnetism as a factor in orienting. So this is definitely a possibility. So the pathways drones and queens use to travel to and from various DCAs are called flyways. On the right is a map of DCAs and flyways in Arizona from a study that Gerald Loper did using radar. And the dots are DCAs and the lines between are flyways. And if you could see this in better detail, you'd see that the flight paths align with roadways and tree lines, and often the DCAs occur in intersections. However, we know that there are DCAs over forested areas and water that don't really have visual cues. So there's just a lot that we don't know about drone congregation areas. So drones, they'll fly around the DCAs, and once they spot and smell a queen, they gather in a comet-like formation and chase the virgin queens. And the strongest, fastest drones reach her and mate with her while they're all in the air, flying about 12 miles an hour, which is crazy, isn't it? So another thing that, now given the opportunity, bees will mate in the flyways, but inbreeding, as we've already said, is not good for honeybees. So the mating process has several really interesting checks in place to discourage inbreeding. When drones leave the hive, they tend to fly up about 26 meters off the ground, which is about the mature tree height, until they get to the DCA. And then they fly between 75 up to 75 meters off the ground. And queens, on the other hand, and the workers, when they leave the nest, they tend to go up and fly at about a height of 8 meters. Now the queens can, when they get to a DCA, mating only takes a few seconds, and so they can invest the energy in flying a little farther away. Because when she finds a DCA, there's going to be hundreds and if not thousands of drones there for her to mate with. So she's going to get lucky. So she can afford to fly farther away. Now the drones, most of them don't get lucky and they need to go back home and refuel because remember, they only have 30 minutes of flight time. So drones prefer to stick closer to home where the queens will go farther away. And I used to have a third of a mile and a whole mile here as measurements, but it really depends just on the saturation of the colonies in that area as to whether or not their DCAs are really close to home. But anyway, the queens fly lower, so they're less likely to encounter their brothers in the flyway, which isn't that amazing that honeybees have evolved this behavior? I think it's just fascinating. Okay, honeybee copulation is a complicated thing, and already I've mentioned that it's done mid-flight on the go. So a queen has found a DCA, and because of her strong pheromones, she attracts this comet of drones chasing her, and drones are going to approach her from below. And once contact is made, it really just takes a few seconds for it to happen. Inside the drone's barrel-shaped abdomen, his endophallus is folded up inside. And it literally everts, so it sort of goes inside out. It's crazy, complicated apparatus. But what he does first is he mounts the queen with his first two pairs of legs. At this point, in order to be successful, the queen has to open her sting chamber. But she sometimes doesn't open her sting chamber. Not all drones who get this far are successful. I like to point out at this point that bees figured out what consent is a long time before humans did because she can refuse. But if she opens her sting chamber, he'll grasp her with all six legs. And then he everts his endophallus into her sting chamber. And this action snaps him backwards and paralyzes him. And then his penis breaks off and is left inside the queen's sting chamber, and he falls to his death. So this whole thing takes 2 seconds, literally. You can hear sometimes an audible pop when it happens. The drone falls to the ground and he dies. Now it's 2 seconds, and then the next drone in line is going to reach her and do the same thing. And there's a little apparatus on the endophallus that sort of scoops out the previous drone's endophallus. And so she can easily mate with, the books will say 12 queens mate with 12 drones average, something like that. But Dave Tarpey's lab, they're doing this work where they dissect queen's spermathecae and they count how many drones that the queens have mate with, and it can be upwards of 50 to 60 drones. And we know that the more drones a queen mates with, the healthier and more vigorous her colony is going to be, because you have to have diverse genetics in the worker population. You want bees who are good wax makers and bees who are good foragers and all of these things. And so really polyandry and multiple mating is the key. So the more she mates with, the better. So she mates with lots and lots of drones, and she flies back to the nest. And sometimes, about 70% of the time, the endophallus, so the last drone that she mated with, is still in her sting chamber. There's mucus on it, and it would probably evolve to keep the semen in while she's flying. But we call this the mating sign. And you see that orange color on the tip. So to our eyes, it's pretty vivid, but to the bees, it's even more vivid because they can see spectrums that we can't. So that might be somehow help the subsequent drones who are coming in to mate. We don't really know. But about 70% of the time, you'll see that. So the drones that don't get lucky and die will fly around for half an hour, and they'll come back, drink a bunch of honey, and they'll set back out again, maybe go into several different DCAs in an afternoon. But if mating doesn't kill him, the workers will, as I mentioned earlier. If resources are scarce, if there's a dearth, if it rains for 2 weeks, and they don't have any resources for them, the workers will refuse them entrance. They're constantly assessing the needs and resources of the colony in some magical way. And if they can't afford them, they won't have them. And then, as I mentioned, by the fall, the workers will get rid of any remaining drones. They're a drain on resources, and they don't need them to overwinter. So there are no old drones in a hive. At this point, if we were in person, somebody might raise their hand and say, I see a few. Occasionally you'll see one or two. I think those fellows just tell good jokes, but there's really not enough to provide any intergenerational learning. So because drones can't sting you, they make great test subjects for queen marking. if you've ever been trepidatious about marking a queen, I mean, it is kind of stressful. You can practice away on drones, and that's a fun club activity too for y'all to do. You can, you get used to handling them. You get used to, because you really want to hold all bees by the thorax, and the stakes aren't very high. And then when you're more comfortable, you can mark your queens. And I want to encourage everyone to let them have their drones. There are a couple ways if you use foundation to do that. You can buy this green plastic drone comb, and it comes in deeps and mediums. If you use this stuff, it's plastic, it's going to be better taken if you paint some wax on it. But you don't even have to buy special equipment. This is just easy to spot. You can do a couple things. If you use deep frames, you can just put a shallow or a medium frame in a deep, and on the bottom, the bees will be happy to build out drone size cells. If they have all foundation, the first comb they make is going to be huge, because they just have this imperative to build these large cells and have room to make drones. And then if they don't need it, they'll fill it with honey. I do a lot of foundation lists, and I find that they'll build new comb above the brood nest in the spring really big, and they'll raise one round of drones, and then they'll fill it with honey, and it's more efficient honey storage. But anyway, so you can do this, and then you'll have a nice little bottom chunk that they continue to fill this out. I just took the picture kind of early. Or you can just pop the foundation out of a frame. So long as you put it between two built out frames of brood, not honey, but brood, they will draw out drone size brood cells. If you just pop it out and just put an empty frame with no foundation, you don't even need the starter strip if you put it in between two fully built out frames. Now, I know what y'all are thinking. Somebody out there's thinking it. What about those mites, Julia? Well, the reason why this green comb exists is because people use it for something called drone mite trapping. We know that Varroa prefers the drones larvae to reproduce in because they pupate for several more days and they can crank out a few more mites. And of course you don't want to, so what this is made for is to put it in, they build the drones, the mites are going to preferentially go in there, you seal it up, you take it out, put it in the freezer, it kills them, and you put it back in and it kills the mites and of course the sad little drones, and clean it up and do it all over again. And a lot of people do this as a chemical-free mite population control in the spring. But what I would encourage you to do is, before you just cull them all, take your capping scratcher tool and just sort of rake it across the frame and pull out a whole clump of drone brood pupae and look at it and, just inspect it carefully. And if it's crawling with mites, yeah, you probably want to cull it. But you might find that it's not. I do this every time. I just pull out, take a little chunk, maybe a little 4-inch section and pull them out. And if they're not riddled with mites, then I put it back in. And you can do that too, not just with the green frames, but with even if you want to just let them make their own. So a sad factoid is that neonicotinoid, which these are systemic pesticides that are everywhere in commercial and in backyard gardeners. That pesticide exposure makes drone sperm counts 39% lower, which is really sad. So I'm a big believer in fighting neonicotinoids. This is an organization, Pollinator Stewardship Council, that does work with that. And I encourage every bee club to support that organization. So how do you find drone congregation areas? What researchers have done in the past is use a weather balloon filled with helium. This red balloon, it looks tiny, but it's actually like 4.5 feet in diameter. It's filled with helium. It's got a kite string, and this is my buddy Courtney holding the kite string. And up here we have some queen pheromone hanging from that. And you're supposed to walk around and look. It really does take two people because it's kind of hard to sort of pilot the kite and use binoculars to look up there to see if you see any bees. And this day was like a textbook picture perfect day. This is a textbook open area with a windbreak, a soccer field near my house. We walked around there for a really long time and didn't see a single insect. That afternoon, we also went to a parking lot with a tall building, didn't see anything. went to a neighbor's backyard that had the same deal, open area with a windbreak, and it was really depressing. And y'all may not know this, but there's actually a worldwide helium shortage that's been going on for a couple of years. That's why helium balloons are so expensive, and it costs about $100 to fill that balloon up with helium. And it was really depressing that day. And I thought, well, I'll just keep at it until the helium runs out. I left the balloon on my front porch, and I came out the next morning, and it was dead on the ground. So it's just not feasible. Sometimes people also, instead of using the balloon, they will walk with a tall pole. You can't get it quite as high as you can a balloon, and then have the pheromone at the top of the pole. But that's also a little bit physically demanding. Not to mention, with both of these methods, we're leaving out a big area, which is the area over trees, right? So you can't monitor any of those areas. And in the books, when it says an open area with a windbreak, I often think, well, how do they know what's over there? Because they can't get to it. So I've been thinking about that for a while. So I ended up, everyone these days has this kind of a drone on the right. Just to keep things clear, when I say drone, I'm talking about these handsome fellas. And when I say UAV, it stands for unmanned aerial vehicle, which is this mechanical kind of drone. So even though I'm not one of those people that just loves to run out and buy some little technology thing like this, I was actually a little bit scared of this UAV just because it's expensive. But I bought one of these, and I had learned how to fly it. I had a neighbor who was a professional UAV pilot. When I first started talking, I didn't know him well. I just knew that he was my neighbor. I started talking about this and said, I've got this idea. And he's like, yeah, I could do something like that. I charge $125 an hour. And I was like, that is awesome. But moving on. And then the next, like a year later, I was talking to him, and he said, I just ran into him on the street, and he said, I was thinking about getting into beekeeping. And I'm like, well, maybe we could help each other out. So I mentored him in beekeeping, and he showed me the ins and outs and helped me learn how to fly this thing. And it worked out great. So what you can't see is that there's thin thread tied right here, and then hanging down, this has got the lure on it. And you want to use thin thread. My first instinct was, we'll get like fishing line or something strong. And my UAV mentor was like, oh, no. You want thin, cheap cotton thread that'll break really easily, because if your lure gets caught on something, you'd rather, have the thread break and lose a couple bucks in lure than to crash your very expensive UAV. So, so you want to use thin thread for lure. They make this product called Temp Queen, which is artificial queen mandibular pheromone, and that's the sex attractant pheromone. It's not the one that smells like lemongrass. It has a completely different profile. And this product is actually made for queenless colonies. When you're ordered a queen, or you need to go pick one up, and you want to keep your workers from developing their ovaries and having a laying worker situation, you put that in. But it works great for this because it's the same sex attractant. And if you can buy it in bulk, and it's a few bucks per stick. So if your club maybe wanted to do this, y'all could kind of go in together. You keep it in the freezer; it'll last for a couple years. Of course, I'm very a little bit anal about it. I have my bags of stuff in the freezer, and I label it and write down all the time it's out of the freezer. But my drone mentor, I'd given him some, and he told me once, we were flying with it months later, and he said, yeah, I just left that thing sitting on my shop floor. I never put it in the freezer, and it worked just fine. So it works great. So you need something to attach the lure to, and also something for the bees to see visually, and also something for your camera on your UAV to see. So these little hair rollers work great because they're light. You just peel off the fuzzy outer layer, and then you want it to weigh between 7 and 10 grams. That seems kind of ideal. But I had a user from the website sent me this picture. She didn't want to go buy a bunch of hair rollers she didn't need. So she just took a pill bottle and drilled holes in it to have a little airflow through. And she said it worked great. So I first started flying with this, the propellers on the UAV generate a lot of wind. And I didn't want to be artificially flooding the area with QMP. I wanted it to be as much like a single virgin queen flying through as possible. So I flew my UAV above me in the SME lane in the driveway until I couldn't feel any of the wind on my face. And that happened with mine at about 20 feet. So I try to keep my line, about 22 feet long wherever possible. just for that reason. So where are you going to look for drone congregation areas? I will admit, it can feel a little bit like looking for a needle in the haystack. I flew for many, many weeks before I found one, and then I found 3 in 1 week. So the depressions in the landscape seem to work in my area. So you can get Google Earth Pro. It's free now. And under the preferences, there's this thing that you can a setting you can change, the elevation exaggeration. You bump it all the way up to 3. And then what you do is you go out to your apiary and you look out, and it'll show, and you kind of move forward towards the depressions, and it'll show drop-offs. And I have found them where there are drop-offs. And again, you want to keep in mind the time of day. And what I would encourage you to do, don't write someplace off because you didn't see drones in DCA once, but maybe go to one place, fly for 5 minutes, come back, go to another one, and then circle back, maybe every hour, go to 3 or 4 for a few minutes, because you might be missing them just because of the time of day. And it can be, it's kind of a Zen thing to do. You're just out there. It's beautiful. You're flying it, and you hope you see some bees. But it can, like I said, it can feel a little bit frustrating when you're not finding them. But when you do, it is so cool. So if you see tens of drones, so this is some lure with, and I was really excited because I thought, oh my gosh, I found a DCA, but it was really just a handful of drones. If you see tens of drones, it's typically a flyway and not a drone congregation area. When you see hundreds and thousands, it's a drone congregation area. So this is a video of, and I hope it translates okay over Zoom. And again, another thing about having the 20 feet of line is you really get a perspective on it when you're filming. And you can see how the drones will start lining up behind each other and kind of flying. It's like they're drafting off each other. And the interesting thing about this drone congregation area is that it is literally one lot away from that soccer field I had in the other. And I've been flying in the soccer field because I'm like, this has to be it. This has to be it. It's it's an open area with windbreak. But notice what this is over. It's over trees. So they're not really following the rules of the book here. Another thing you can see the roadway here. The soccer field is just past this on the left. Oops, oh my goodness, sorry about that. Another, okay, I already said that about the field, sorry. Let me see it's against this. So this is my citizen science project. It's called mapmydca.com. And my idea was that I wanted a place where people could pin drone congregation areas. So on the website, you can read all about drones, about DCAs and finding DCAs. It's pretty much the method that I've outlined here. But on the homepage, you can click on View the DCA Map, and it'll take you to a Google map. And if you zoom in, I've zoomed in on the Atlanta area. If you roll over one of the pins and you click on the details button, you'll see the information that the user uploaded. The dates, the time, and anything that's entered is, it's up to the user if they want to enter it, or even if they want to put their name on it. And then if you scroll down, this says YouTube flight of this video of this flight. So I've posted videos of a lot of DCAs. If you want to see more, you can go there. But back to the homepage, anyone who wants can, back to this one, download all DCA data. So my hope is that people will pin DCAs, and then we'll at least have, because it is hard. You'll be surprised how many researchers don't even know where their drone congregation areas are. And since they remain the same year after year, remain constant, I just thought it would be great to have some data on it. And, with all the tools that are coming out just on Google Maps alone and algorithms, we can certainly get more information. So anyone who wants the information can get it. And right now I'm just trying to reach as many beekeepers as possible and get them to find the drone congregation areas. So one thing I don't cover on the website or in this talk is how to fly the UAV. They're aircraft. They can cause damage. You could fly into a car, God forbid, and cause an accident. So you really need to educate yourself and learn how to properly fly this. So you have to register them, and there's all kinds of rules and regulations. And also, you just want to be a good a good bee ambassador, which we always have to be anyway, right? When my mentor flies his UAV, he wears a reflective vest. I don't want to do that. I kind of refuse. But I'm always nice to people, and most of the time I'm well received. But one time I was flying, and in this little cul-de-sac, it was just like a mile from my house, and I was finishing up. I hadn't found anything, and this guy pulls up in a pickup truck, and he's like, "Okay, what are you doing?" He was clearly not happy with me. I'm like, "Hey, I'm actually doing some honeybee research, but I don't want to offend you. So let me just land my UAV here." And he was like, "Well, what do you mean bee research? What is this?" So I kind of briefly explained. And so I'm like, "But, I'm pretty much done for the day. I don't want to offend you." So, well, okay, I was going to call the cops, but I guess I'm all for bees. That's okay. And then he goes, "I know a beekeeper," people will do. I'm like, "Oh yeah, what beekeeper? You never know, I might know them." He's like, "No, you don't know. She's not from Atlanta. She's from Cumming. I know her from kayaking." And I was like, "Oh, that must be Kelly Campbell." And he was like, "Oh yeah, you're right. It is Kelly." I'm like, "Yeah, I know Kelly. She's great." So, by the time I left, he'd asked me to fly my drone back up and take a picture of his house and email it to him. But I was driving home, and before I even got home, I'm only a mile away, I get this screenshot of this conversation that Kelly had with this guy that she sent me, where he said, "Some bee lady was flying a drone over a house today saying she was looking for male honeybees zooming over my treetops. WTF. She said she knew you, so I figured she had to be cool, so I didn't shoot her." So I live in Georgia. Y'all live in Tennessee. People have guns. You always want to be careful. If the law is that your UAV can fly over private property so long as your feet are not on private property. So you can't trespass, but your aircraft can. So that's the letter of the law. However, people don't always see eye to eye on that. So just like in anything, you just want to be prepared for that, be prepared to land and have a smile and explain yourself. So if you don't want to go get a UAV, or if you don't know someone with one, and if you do know someone with UAV, lots of teenagers have them and they just want a reason to fly. So another thing that happens, though, is that drones are attracted to the motors of the UAV. So you can Google drones and honeybees, and you'll see all kinds of YouTube videos of people saying, "Oh, these swarming bees attacked my drone." And that's not what happened. They just flew into a drone congregation area. So I just did a quick Google search on drone clubs, and I've reached out to these clubs. I'm kind of waiting to hear back from some of them. But you can just reach out to your local UAV enthusiasts and say, if y'all ever come across a bunch of bees flying, let me know where it is. And you could go out and, the reason why they call them drones is because of the roar that they make. And I live in the city, so sometimes it's hard to hear, but I have been in a DCA and heard that roar, which is it just sends chills down your spine. It's so cool. But so you might be able to get some tips on where DCAs are, though, from talking to other drone pilots who really have nothing to do with honeybees. So that is pretty much the end of my talk. I just wanted to mention that the Bee Informed Partnerships National Colony Loss and Management Survey is live every year in April. They ask beekeepers to fill out this survey and tell about the colony loss. And it's the Bee Informed Partnership is the largest. They held the largest repository of data on honeybees, and that's when you'll hear the story come out about how many colony losses, and it's based on this survey. So everyone, please participate. You can go to beeinformed.org. They've made it a little shorter this year, which is awesome. But as a Bee Informed Partnership board member, I would appreciate everyone doing that. And you all should tell all your friends. So it's open during the entire month of April. And that is the end of my talk. This is a photo of me landing my UAV, and you see all these little black specks. Occasionally, the drones will follow you all the way to the ground, which is really cool to see. They'll just be zooming around you. So if there are any questions, and this is my email, that's the website. I'm on social media at mapmydca.com, but I'd be happy to take any questions.
I could start off and ask, so the density of these DCAs that's completely not known, so that you could have 5 in one area, or, 1 is the maximum in a certain area. Is there anything known about them like that?
The density has everything to do with how many colonies are in the area. So it just is directly correlated to that. So if there are a lot of beehives or bee colonies living in the area, you'll have more. There's not really a number, but I live in an area, I mean, I pretty much know where all my beekeepers are, but there's a lot of beekeepers. So there's a DCA that is like less than a quarter mile from my house. So it can be, it can be 150 yards from your apiary. There could be a DCA. And the more dense the population, the more DCAs that you'll have. They did a study to see how far queens would fly, and they went to a remote area and set up colonies. And somehow they magically knew, that there weren't any other colonies in the area. And they found that they could get a queen to fly 10 miles away, and 25% of the time she would be successful. I'm not really sure how they engineered that, but they'll go where they need to go. But another interesting study about the drones getting to DCAs that was done, they took a bunch of colonies and they marked every single drone in the colony, and they put them on a truck at night and they took them to an area 10 miles away where they had mapped out the drone congregation areas. And they opened the colonies in the morning and they were at the DCAs monitoring. And within 15 minutes, they were catching those painted drones. So within 15 minutes, the drones found the DCAs. So, I mean, there really is, there's something there, but we don't know what the there is.
That's amazing. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's questions in the chat, Erwin.
It's my question.
What's your question? I can't.
Well, the question was whether you've gone back to the same DCA year after year.
Whether I have,
Yes.
I have gone back. There's a few populous ones that I visited. Yes, I have. And I try to encourage people to not pin one until you've been back at least once, just to make sure it wasn't a fluke. There was one area that I thought might be a DCA, and when I went back, I didn't see anything. So I think it was just a flyway, so I didn't pin it. And, I mean, with all citizen science stuff, there might be some things pinned that maybe weren't proper DCAs, but for the most part, it's sort of like, if you're not sure, it probably isn't a DCA, but you're sure when you see that footage and see all those bees, Yeah. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to share, because I'm trying to get the word out about the project and also about just about drones, and don't disparage them. They kind of get a bad rap, but the longer you're in honeybees, the more you appreciate all these intricacies. And it's not just about the honey, it's about the whole superorganism. So I appreciate your time, and hope you guys have a great day. May all your swarms be low.
Thank you very much.